Sorry for the delay. I had a student needed to talk after class and went a little longer than I thought. So we'll be underway here in just a minute. Okay, let's get started. Hope everybody's doing well. Got a good first half of the week. Okay. So, I want to continue talking about Aristotle's virtue ethics today as we begin at the very end of class on Tuesday. And we're going to start about halfway through our time, maybe a little further than that. We're going to start reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich together. And I hope that you find that book as impactful and moving as I have. That is one that is definitely one of my personal favorites. Not an easy book to read in some ways, but nonetheless a very, very important one. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. Start with, we'll just make a couple announcements. One is, I'm going to go to Canvas, back to Canvas, to try to streamline the reading a little bit as far as in the module, all of your reading documents are there. Apparently some people have had a hard time finding the particular document matched to a certain week, so I'll see if I can group those together by week instead of just having a list of titles, if that helps, so in case anybody was lost on that. And also, the quiz for this week is actually the material from September 8th through 10th. I extended that to tonight, I believe. Yeah. Or if you don't see it yet, let's see. Wait a minute. By now you've all taken that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't it the third one that it's like?
Yeah. Disregard that. The third one is due tomorrow. I've got it open until tomorrow night. Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I got you flipped up with another class there for a minute. So right, the one that was posted last week was on the wrong date. That's open until tomorrow night. That one, only that one is open book. Okay. So anyway, I'll just try to streamline the material so it's easier, more easily accessible. And don't forget about the paper. It's going to be due on a week from tomorrow at midnight. I did put up the slides from last class. I put those up in the module, and also one other from earlier lecture. I'll do that bit by bit. I'll start putting all the lecture slides that I've shown so far on Canvas so you can access those. But the effective writing one is up. So that's of any help, you can review that. And remember, with the paper, just another note of another reminder. The main thing I'm looking for is that you are explaining yourself and explaining your beliefs by the principles of that argument evidence format. All right, so that you're not just asserting this is the way I see things, this is the way I make ethical decisions, but you're explaining why. You have a certain view, you have a certain way of thinking about, wrong and right, and thinking about what's the right way to conduct yourself. Well, why is that way of viewing it? What is it that compels you to say this is the best way to approach? These are the principles that should be in play there. So the explanation along with the assertion is what I'm looking for. And again, and it's not a paper that gives you enough you're not going to have enough space to go on and on in minute detail, but I just want to see that you're reasoning in that way. That you're saying, this is why I believe what I believe, not just saying, here it is. Okay?
Mike?
Yes.
In that paper, do you want specific examples of our thinking as well?
Whatever's most compelling, you know. If you're thinking, okay, I believe in God, let's say, and that's going to be the principle that you live your life before a personal God to whom you're accountable. Okay, you might say, one of the reasons that makes this view, this belief so compelling to me is that I believe that it's only by, in the light of the existence of a personal God that we can explain our moral convictions and why we understand so clearly and so fundamentally that it's wrong to murder another person. Well, I don't think that, let's say just social conditioning, that being told to us as we're children from our parents, and I don't think that explains the depth and the passion that we have to understand that conviction, to have that conviction. I think God, so that's a reason. That's an explanation of this is why I believe in God. Because this is an evidence that compels me to believe that, right? Rather than, ever since I can remember, I always believed that there was a God watching over me, and that's been the best way for me to make decisions, thinking of, what God would be pleased with, what behavior. That's good, but why? What is it that compels you to hold that belief, right? So, and like I said, don't get hung up on, you're not necessarily trying to convince me. I mean, if I think you offer weak evidence, I'll critique that. I'll say, I don't think that's compelling. But the point here is not for you to convince me so much as for me to see that you're thinking in that way, right? That you're thinking in terms of evidence and reasons. You're not just stating, this is the case. This is the family I come from. This is the place I've grown up in. Therefore, I believe. But you're saying, and this is why, this is compelling, right? Zach?
Something that I've seen recently that I've been kind of interested in is epistemology.
Yeah.
Which, just a way to by using questions, you kind of uncover whether their belief system is logical or whether they need to kind of develop that a little bit more. So that's really interesting. Just there's a YouTuber, Street Epistemology, that it's really interesting to watch. But yeah, just sometimes people just believe without having a reason to, or and really having that kind of dialogue allows you to kind of examine your beliefs and not necessarily attack them, but just re-examine it and try to figure out why you believe it.
Very well said. Not to attack, but to examine. But very well said. And yeah, and in fact, that's epistemology is essentially, this is an epistemological paper. This is what the paper's all about. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of knowledge and specifically knowledge acquisition. So essentially, the study of epistemology is centered on the question, how or why or how do you believe what you believe? Right? So you say, I believe X, okay. How did you come to that point? You concluded that X is true. What was the process you went through to come to that conclusion? Right? Yeah, so good point.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you want to know the process of believing and then the result of believing.
Yeah, those would be really good to include in, especially the process.
Process.
And you can even say things. Don't get hung up on like you have to have something really, really specific. Like you witnessed a miracle, or you saw a man, his leg was severed, and then all of a sudden someone prayed for him and he stood up with 2 legs again, right? I'm not saying you have to cite something like that, but you can talk about, like I said, moral convictions. I think that's a pretty powerful, that's a pretty compelling reason to believe in some sort of deity, that this is where the depth, this explains the depth and strength and passions of our moral convictions, because we've been created by one from whom those convictions come, right? So, but see, in saying that, I'm giving an explanation. I'm not just saying, well, one, I've always believed in this, or believing in this brings me great comfort. Okay, well, a lot of things can bring you comfort, but that doesn't mean that those things are true, right? And keep in mind, too, that sometimes things can make sense and not be true. Okay, so, for example, I could tell you about my past history, about how I was right out of college and enlisted in the Navy, and I went to officer candidate school and became a fighter pilot, and I could tell you where I was stationed and what countries I was in and the exact types of aircraft that I flew. And I could give you a very detailed and logically consistent explanation, but that's not true. I've never been in the military, right? That's false, okay? So it's not just about making sense in terms of logical consistency. That's a different question of whether something's actually true. So epistemology is focused on the concern of what is it that compels you to conclude that, yes, this is right, this is real. And this is, in this paper, we're talking more about principles. So this principle is a non-negotiable. This is the way people should, this is what they should consider, this is what should frame their decision-making, that kind of thing. So, yeah, in fact, maybe I should have talked about epistemology in the paper, and that this is really the pursuit that epistemology is all about. All right, and as always, just contact me, excuse me, contact me as you're in the writing process if you have any questions or anything I can help you with as you go along. All right, so let's get back to Aristotle's virtue ethics. All right, we ended up on Tuesday in this line here in parentheses when he's talking about the difference between humans, plants, and animals, and what it is that should distinguish us. And remember, the central question is, what's the purpose? What's the function? And that those words generally work interchangeably in the piece here. When he talks about the function of man, he's talking about what is man's purpose, what is our reason for existence. So he says, look, it's different than plants. Plants have the bios, remember the two Greek words for life. They have bios. Their cells multiply. Plants grow from small to large. They increase in size. Well, so do we. Yes, but there's more to us than that. Okay, what about sentience and just mental cognition? Well, cows have that. All right, a cow can, with the cow's brain, the cow looks and sees, a green pasture here and sees barren dirt over here, and then you might say makes a decision based on cognition and goes toward the green pasture. Okay, we do that, but there's more to us than just that. So Aristotle says, what is it? What is that? The difference with human beings. And he keys in on that, a big part of it at least, in this quote in parentheses, where he says the other thing that distinguishes us is that which possesses reason and initiates thought. And so I was saying that, like analogy of the cubby holes, think of in terms of memory. If all your memories, let's picture your brain as this massive system of cubby holes, and all of your memories are put in the cubby hole boxes. And then there's this, mechanical claw that goes up like the games at the fair, and pulls out a memory for you to think about. And maybe it's a positive memory from your childhood, or maybe from a great experience or a trip, and you want to think about that. It's good to think about that. So you pull it out of the cubby hole and you focus on that. And there's some difficult memories, and you keep those locked away in the cubby holes, and the mechanical claw doesn't go get that memory out because you don't want to think about it. Okay, well the question is, who's moving the claw? All right, what's determining what memories get pulled out to think about and not? Or, just like I said the other day, when you're driving around thinking about something frivolous, and you think, I shouldn't be thinking about that. That's a waste of time. That's silly. Rather, I should think about this. This is important. Who makes that decision? All right, like I said, when you change your mind, what's going on there? And Aristotle says this is something much different than a change of weather, or just a shifting, like a cow shifting to the greener grass to get more calories. We have a will, and we can deliberately make choices about what we think, about what we invest ourselves in, and how we behave. We are not simply products of our physiological impulses, or at least we don't have to be. That's what makes us different. Okay, so he goes on, and he says, I think we talked a little bit about his analogy of the harpist. Musical instrument is a great illustration. If you go into, say, the music hall on campus, and you go into a practice room, and you see some guy sitting down with a guitar, and he's got it flipped upside down, and he's beating the back like a bongo. then we would say, well, that guy doesn't know how to play guitar. That's a bad guitar player. Where if you saw somebody playing the guitar, and it's an incredibly sophisticated, beautiful piece of music, and it's just flowing out of him so naturally, then you would say, now that's how you play guitar. Right? That's how it's supposed to be done. That's the way. So he's working off that analogy, and then he says this. Look right here, that part. And if we assume that the function, of man is a kind of life, that is an activity or series of actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and if the function of a good man is to perform these well and rightly, and if every function is performed well when performed in accordance with its proper excellence. Do you remember early in the semester, maybe second week of class or so, I made this point somewhat in passing, but this point about the artist, you know, how if you're an artist, or even if you're not a talented artist, but you make art, whatever it is, or maybe you're rearranging a room, or yard, landscaping or whatever, there's that tendency when you're finished, or you think you're finished, you want to be finished, and yet you say, but if I just added this, if I just added some accent here, or if I put this picture next to that one, then it would really set things off. Or if you're out, say outdoors, and you go for maybe a hike or a picnic, and you say, this is great, but if we got around, around the trail and we could see this other range, then, well, what's going on there is that we have some notion of the perfect view. The view in which you would change nothing because it's exactly right. Or the perfect picture, or the perfect room, or whatever it is, where there's no adjustment needed. If we didn't have that, then you couldn't say, I'm going to change this, and therefore, and then it will be, because when we say things, and then, we have this concept of a destination point, or an end point. Well, Aristotle says the same thing about virtues, and about human conduct. And when we talk about a good person, or, so if I say that, I'm sorry, I want to call you Cade. Caden, not Cade, Caden. Caden. All right, so I've got Cade, Clay, and Cole, and Cade in, and it's hard to keep track. Anyway, so let's say Lucy and Caden, right? If I said, I'm talking to a third person after class, I say, you didn't hear this from me, but Lucy's a much better person than Caden. Okay? Well, I can't say that without some idea of a perfect person. Because what I mean when I say better, that she's better than him, is that she's closer to the ideal. Now, I've never met anybody about whom I could say he's a perfect person, but anytime we make that statement, we're defining better and good in terms of the perfect, or in reference to the perfect. So, point being, here again, Aristotle is pointing to the necessity, the logical necessity of this perfect divine power or being, or whatever we want to call it. And this actually is very fundamental to another philosopher, a French philosopher from many years later, René Descartes. He talks about the same thing. We're going to get into that next week, so I'll come back to that. So, he says, basically the purpose, to answer that question, what is the purpose of human life? It's to live a life of perfect virtue. That's the end point. That's what and when we say somebody's good or better than another, that means that person is closer to that point of perfect virtue. All right. That's what he means by this line here in the highlight. If every function is performed well, when performed in accordance with its proper excellence, or its most right example. If all this is true, he says, if all this is so, the conclusion is that the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Or if there are more kinds of virtue than one, in accordance with the best and most perfect kind. That's the human blueprint, says Aristotle. That is the purpose of human life. The purpose of a guitar and a guitar player is to play it well, to play it fluidly and beautifully. The purpose of a dentist is to repair teeth. The purpose of a human being, says Aristotle, is to live a life of virtue, of courage, compassion, generosity, self-control, bravery, fortitude, and so forth. All right, well, clear enough, makes sense, but he has more to say. Yes, Ron.
I'm just going to ask if at that time they weren't necessarily deists, but they would identify the individual virtues that they thought were good, and then say like the perfect execution of these virtues is the ideal. Whereas a theist might say, my God, embodies all of these perfect virtues, and thus I identify him as the ideal.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. And the point that Aristotle insists on is that a perfect divine being is a logical necessity, both forward and backward. Backward meaning Aristotle emphasized what he calls the first cause, or the prime mover. We'll talk a little bit about the medieval philosopher, or much later philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, who was a great proponent of Aristotle, and he said the same thing. You can't have infinite regrets. So I can't say, hey, where do you come from? Who do you come from? You say, well, my parents. Okay, right, but where do they come from? From my grandparents. Okay, well, we can't do that infinitely. I mean, there has to be a point where there was a first person. And we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So I'll go ahead and use an analogy that we'll talk about more when we get into philosophy of religion next week. So I didn't mention here the dominoes, did I?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, well, yeah, I did mention that. Like the dominoes. You can't say that, and it's confusing because I have a different class in the same room. You can't say that that which knocked over the first domino was another domino. That's logically deficient, because it's logically necessary that whatever the power was, this is dictated by the law of inertia. All right. If an object is stationary, it will not move by its own power. If it's sheer matter, it has to be acted upon by an outside force. Right. So the first domino has to be affected by something that's not a domino. Right? You have to have that beginning point. So you say that, okay, Aristotle would not have defined the deity because he didn't believe in Yahweh. He wasn't Jewish. He didn't believe in Allah because Islam didn't exist at this point in history, Jesus had not been born in Bethlehem yet, right? So he doesn't have any defined religions that we would recognize in terms of identifying God. But what Aristotle said is that it's just a logical necessity. There has to be something, some sort of perfect, immovable, immutable being who has a will, who has an intent. Only that can explain how there's something rather than nothing. Right? That the world exists, that people exist, that there was a beginning point. Right? And only that can make any sense of our language when we talk about somebody being better than another, or somebody being good. Because, and he makes the point, I didn't read over it, but just prior to this, he says, when you talk about the purpose of a guitar or a harp, that's really just a synonym a synonym for saying the perfect way to play it. Because the purpose of it is to be played to its full measure, right? To be played in exactly the way it's supposed to be played. And that's why when we perceive something's perfect, you see let's say a football game, and it's late in the game, and the offensive team is behind by 6 points, or let's say 3 points, and there's 2 seconds left. Quarterback drops back, gets the snap is clean and just right. All the linemen make their blocks just right. He steps back, throws a 60-yard pass, hits his receiver right in the numbers in the end zone. Clock goes down, game over. And you say, now that's how the game's supposed to be played, right? That's perfect. That's what it means to play football, right? So what Aristotle's saying is, okay, you say, what's the purpose of football? Then we say that's the purpose of football. Perfect. So the point is, you can't take this fixed ideal away and make any sense of what you're talking about in terms of purpose and how it should be done. So let me put it more simply. Aristotle, the logical argument is, if you take out a divinity, in other words, a perfect being, then you just can't use words like should and ought and better and good. You just can't. Those are unintelligible. So even though Aristotle couldn't identify that being, right, through, like in religious language, what we would call revelation, he's just by thinking, by logical inference, he says that's got to be there. This is a tangent, I admit, but it's a really interesting one, and I'll say it since it's Ryan's fault because he's brought the question up. But one fascinating thing, and again, you'll meet plenty of people, you certainly can meet plenty of people that would argue against this, but sometimes you'll hear people in debate say, like, people that want to argue for the validity of the Bible as divine revelation, and they'll set that against like the creation accounts in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. They'll pose that as an opposing view of the Big Bang. And you'll hear people say, I believe in God. I don't hold to this idea of a Big Bang. And that's deeply confused because it's quite interesting. There are few scientific discoveries that do more to illustrate or provide physical evidence for this idea of a prime mover, of a creator, than the Big Bang and the redshift and Edwin Hubble and all that was discovered there in the 20th century. Because, okay, what do we mean when we say a divine being? A being that exists outside time and space. Okay? A being that's not subject to the three-dimensional world that we live in. Well, the Big Bang Theory says there is a singular explosion point from which not only the physical world began to exist, but remember, in light of Albert Einstein, time and space are components of the physical world. All right, we usually think of, like, you have the world evolving and developing in mountains and oceans and animals and people, and it's going along, and then there's time up and above that. But after Einstein, that's not the concept. The concept is that time is actually a part of the physical world like mountains are. So the question is, I mean, given that that's pretty well established, there was such a thing as a Big Bang, and what's the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is expanding and losing energy as it goes forward. Well, it all started at a singular point. Time and space started at that point, so what was before that? Right? There has to be something before the Big Bang, right? Which would be atemporal, aspatial, and so forth, which is, a long way of saying what most people mean by God. Anyway, that does kind of undergird what the point that this is, Aristotle's working on logical inference, not divine revelation, but it's interesting because he comes to a similar conclusion. And this is a little ahead of ourselves, but when Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, starts to promote Aristotle's writings, he took a lot of flack from these other Catholic authorities, and they said, listen, Aristotle was a pagan. Aristotle lived before Christ. He wasn't. You can't do this. And Aquinas essentially said, no, he's saying the same thing we're saying. He's just coming at a different angle, but we're really coming to similar conclusions here. Anyway, we'll talk more about that when we get into the philosophy of religion. All right, so he says, yes, there in fact is a purpose for human beings, whether you're a dentist or a construction worker or a teacher or a policeman. There is a way you should be, and that way is virtuous, that you should live a life of virtue. And if you do that, then you're living, then it can be said of you, now that's how a person is supposed to live. All right, you see the guitar player, the maestro, playing so beautifully, and you say, now that's how guitar is supposed to be played. Okay, when you live a fully virtuous life, then someone would look at you and say, now that's how a person's supposed to be. That's a good person. That's how the human instrument is played, you might say. All right. So that's his answer. Well, can't stop there, though, because there's one more extremely important qualification, which he says here in the next paragraph. There is a further qualification. In a complete lifetime, one swallow does not make a summer, neither does one day. Similarly, neither can one day or a brief space of time make a man blessed and happy. Every rational activity aims at some end or good. One end, like the one activity, may be subordinate to another. Okay, and then he goes back in talking about this standard of perfection. But this point that one swallow does not make a summer. One bird that comes in the warm weather, just because you see one bird, that doesn't mean it's summertime. Neither is one hot day. It's quarter of the year. That's what we're talking about when we talk about summer. So here is a point from Aristotle that I cannot exaggerate how important, how applicable this is to our everyday life, our everyday decision making. This completely undermines this notion that philosophy is just abstract navel gazing, disconnected from the real world. Okay, this is front and center, brass tacks, everyday stuff. One of the central emphases in Aristotle's teaching about virtue ethics is the importance of habits, of specifically mental habits and volitional habits, or habits of decision making. One swallow doesn't make a summer. One virtuous act doesn't make a virtuous person. It's a commitment a development of the habit of practicing and pursuing virtues over a lifetime that develops a person into the virtuous person. Very strong parallel here again with physical conditioning. Let's say you want to run a marathon, and you've never ran before, you don't run now, you don't do really anything to physical exertion, and you say, I'm going to do this. I want to run a marathon. So you say, I'm going to do it, I signed up, and you go out the following Saturday, and you just go out on your street and you run as far and as fast as you can until you throw up, okay? Or until you pass out, either one, which comes first. So you do that, you give it all you've got, and let's say you run 3 miles. Okay, you did it, you gave it all you got. Now you're ready for the marathon. No, you're not, right? If you're going to do it, you've got to invest day after day, week after week for however many months it takes you to condition yourself where you're able to do that. So he's saying the same point about virtues, that it's not just, it's important to be, compassionate. So I see this person over here that's in need. I'm going to move to help this person. Okay, there you go. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a development process. So here's where I'm saying this is so applicable, so important. And I think that his point here might be more difficult for us to really grasp and internalize because of the culture in which we live. You might just call it a suspicion, but I think it's pretty well substantiated. Western culture is very, very individualized. There's a huge priority placed on individual rights, individual choices. So for example, for most of us, the idea that if you're married or if you get married, that your parents would choose your spouse for you, that you have no say in who you marry. I mean, that's just utterly outrageous to most Americans and most Western Europeans. That would just be just stunningly outrageous. Well, that's not so in other parts of the world. And throughout much of history, that's been a common case because in other cultures, it's more of a communal instead of an individualistic culture where the decision for marriage is not just made on what you personally like or want or you're personally individually inclined toward. It's made in the best interest of the clan or the family or the community, and maybe marrying into this, linking this family or this clan with that clan through marriage is best for the whole community. Well, then you get married, right? Because the best interest is not just about the individual. I'm not talking about the good or bad in that. I'm grateful that we do live in the culture that we do in that sense. But what I'm saying is, I suspect at least, that one of the byproducts and maybe pitfalls, vulnerabilities, you could say, of our culture is that we might be prone to think that our decisions and our individual acts can be isolated from the rest of our life and development. So that we can do something bad or good, but that's just this isolated thing that happened yesterday, or that happened 6 months ago. That doesn't define me or affect me. That's isolated, from the rest of my life, so to speak. I'm over-exaggerating here, I'm being simplistic, but I think we're prone to that type of outlook. And Aristotle's point here is exactly the opposite. That all of our decisions, even mundane ones, even simple ones, everyday ones, they have a formative power. And especially when we're talking about attitudes and interactions with other people. Our decisions have a formative power, and all of us are in a process of development. All of us are in a process of becoming something, as I said earlier on Tuesday. We're all on a trajectory. We're all moving in a certain direction. Right? So for example, I think I mentioned this earlier too, like say it's Miriam, right? Miriam comes up to me after class, I think I just reiterate what I was saying on Tuesday, and says, hey, I was really confused about the reading. I say, hey, listen, can you just handle it yourself? Are you 10 years old? I mean, I got stuff to do, okay? I've got important things to take care of. I can't hold your hand with the reading. Okay, well, that might seem insignificant, and I might be tempted to think, well, I didn't sleep well the night before, and I'm not feeling good. I'm under stress, or whatever. Okay, but if I do that, and I don't rectify, if I don't come back and find Miriam say, hey, listen, I was out of line. I really apologize. I shouldn't have said that. I can change my trajectory in that way, but that would be a way of virtue because that would be humility, which is a fundamental virtue. But if I just go on and I have the sense that, well, I get up feeling better tomorrow, maybe I sleep better tonight and my stress is relieved, whatever, and I say, well, that was in the past. That was in the past, right? I'm an individual. I can choose to be, just let that go, right? Well, no. That has a formative effect on me. And if that goes, if I don't rectify that, then next week, in another class, when another student comes and asks me something afterwards, then it's going to be a little bit easier for me to say, hey, look, will you just take care of that? I'm not your babysitter. And then maybe a couple months, not only will it be easier for me to be crude or not crude, but calloused and insensitive, but maybe I would say something even worse than just kind of blowing somebody off. Maybe I would insult the person. And if I continue down that track, maybe in a few years, I might do something criminal to that person. And then after that, who knows where it goes? Because everybody's in process of formation. Everybody's moving down a certain trajectory, and it's our daily decisions, our mental habits, and the habits that we develop in interacting with other people make us into certain kinds of people. Zach?
Well, it's just kind of interesting to like think of how serial killers get to that point, like Ted Bundy or something like that. And it's really fascinating to. I try not to like get into those documentaries too much because they're disturbing, but like.
But you just can't help it, right?
Right. Yeah. Or shows like Criminal Minds or something like that. I binge watch, you know. But yeah, it's fascinating to see how they get to that point, just like the decisions in their life, or like how at one point in their life they just seemed like a normal person.
Absolutely right. And now, given I'm sure there are born psychopaths, and you could find that, but that's rare. It's almost never the case that you have some well-adjusted, clear-headed person with a strong, moral compass and decent, virtuous person that just wakes up one morning and says, I've never stabbed anybody. I wonder what that would be like. I think I'll go experiment today just to see what just for the experience of it. It doesn't work that way. And here's the thing: you bring up somebody like Ted Bundy, or you bring up some heinous crime. You hear something on the news, and we hear something like that, and we can't even conceive it. It's so shocking, it's so outrageous. You think, man, how? I just don't understand how that could be. In many cases, there was probably a time in the criminal's life who performed this act, may have been a long, long time ago, but there probably was a time in his past where he would have said, how can anybody do that? Would have said the same thing, but over that long, gradual process of development, they descend into this point where they become that. Cole?
Just that thought process just slightly reminded me of Crime and Punishment, because that's almost like the basis of the book. Like, he thinks, okay, everything is naturalistic, so therefore, rightfully so, I can kill whoever I want. And so he kills his landlady because she's a horrible person.
Right.
But then throughout the course of this very long book, he goes through the guilt of having to deal with that he wasn't expecting.
Right? And exact same theme is central to the book from which you read. I'm sorry, you didn't read that. It's another class. Another Dostoevsky book, The Brothers Karamazov. Same thing. That you have this character that says, well, and again, it's back to Aristotle's point. If there's no divine authority, if there's really nothing, why not? Why not? It's the same principle. But this process of development, think about how many criminals, where they started out, what they were like as teenagers. And like I said, you can see some that were just pathological from the beginning, but oftentimes the crime will be the result of a long process of development. Yeah.
Also, kind of what you're saying, like how people who are regular people, or people who are criminals, used to look back and say, how could people do that? Oftentimes, isn't it something that happens to them in their past life, like the roles are opposite, or someone does something bad to them, and so then that triggers something in them.
Sure.
To go on to do something to other people.
And then that gets replicated in their own behavior. Yeah, I mean, it's really shocking how many sex offenders were sexually abused earlier in life. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, right? Yeah, for sure. And this is I say this cautiously because this is a complex topic that we would need to talk about a lot of details. But to tie that to one of Aristotle's principles here in the piece is that even still, and certainly if somebody has experiences of trauma like that, we should all be sympathetic and really feel for that person, but there's still a capacity for choice, right? So I'll just relate a personal experience. One of my best friends, somebody who's probably one of the wisest and I would say virtuous, somebody who is just the most level-headed person I know, and one of them, and very much in control of herself, and is able to kind of sit back and make an assessment of situations and proceed with wisdom and prudence. That same person was sexually abused by both her father and brother as a child. And I mean like an older, like a 10, 12-year-old. Which is just horrendous. And she says, this had a huge impact, and I struggled with a lot of things in my life because of that. But she still had a capacity to make choices and to choose how she allowed, where she allowed that to take her. So in other words, she didn't allow that to turn her into a victim in a lot of ways. I think that's a really powerful example. But that's also what Aristotle is talking about, that's what makes us different from animals. That we're not just products of our environment, and we're not just products of our instincts. We can actually choose how we respond to our instincts. We can choose how we respond to that which happens to us that was beyond our control. So that's how he makes the gradation of plants, animals, humans. We're in that separate tier because we can freely choose our response in that way. And by the way, the trajectory works in the opposite way, of course, too, because the more so for example, Miriam comes up to me after class and says, hey, I need some help with this reading. And I say, maybe I'm stressed. Maybe I only slept 2 hours last night. Maybe I have something else going on that's really, really working on me, and I'm just anxious to get out of the room. But if I stop and say, okay, wait a minute, let me do my best to be helpful here. Okay, it's not her fault that I'm dealing with this kind of stress. I can't take that out, And I stop and try to calmly offer help. Okay, well, the next time, it's going to be easier for me to do that. Okay? And the next time, it's going to be easier. And then on down the line. Here's another real life example, just to tag on to something I said Tuesday. I think this just sets the premise here in clear light in terms of what he means by, look, it's not one swallow that makes a summer. It's a lifetime of pursuing virtue that makes that enables a person to fulfill their purpose as a virtuous person. Okay, so I talked about the married man and the appetites, right? The married man who's tempted with the attraction to another woman has to pull back the reins of the horse of emotion and appetite. Okay, well, let's pose a similar one to illustrate the principle of virtue ethics. Same situation. You got a young guy. Let's say he's 22. He's been married for a year. Okay, and he goes to work. A new worker gets hired, and it's this woman who's roughly the same age. He finds her very attractive. She's charming, personable, easy to talk to, and it just so happens they work in the same workspace, and they talk to each other. Their tasks are such they have to talk, as co-workers all day, and then they get to talking over their breaks, and they get to talking after work, and then they go have lunch together. And now he's feeling this really strong attraction to this woman, and she's just so easy to talk to and understanding. And then he finds himself in the teeth of this crisis, because he says, no, I'm married. I've committed to be faithful to my wife. I shouldn't be pursuing another woman. I shouldn't give in to this temptation. But she's so easy to talk to, and I've never felt about anybody like I feel about her. But I'm committed to my wife, and he's got this inner tug of war, and it's excruciatingly painful. And he loses sleep. He stays up at night, and he's just wrestling and struggling in the depth of this crisis. Okay, well, let's say eventually he says, okay, listen, I've got to do what's right here. And what's right is to be faithful to my wife. All right? I'm going to choose to pursue virtue. The virtue specifically of faithfulness and integrity to my commitment. So I'm going to, make some pretty serious boundaries on the kinds of conversations I have with this woman. I'm not going to put myself in a situation to, be alone with her somewhere off outside work and so forth. And I'm not going to let myself go in that direction. I'm going to be faithful. Okay. So things work out well. Doesn't get inappropriate with the other woman. She gets transferred a year later to another department. They don't work together. Okay. Let's say 3 years later, same thing happens. Attractive woman is hired, works right next to him. They get to talking. She's easy to talk to and charming, and there's an attraction there. Well, it's a temptation, but it's not as much of a crisis as it was the first time. Because he made that decision the first time to pursue virtue. that conditioned him, that developed him in a certain way, moved him down a certain trajectory to where now, still there, still a little struggle, but it's not a crisis. He's not staying up at night losing sleep over it because he's become more virtuous and therefore become more, you might say, immune to the temptation. Still a struggle, but not as much. Okay, 15 years later, let's say he works in the same office, and the same thing happens. This really attractive woman comes in, and he hits it off with her, she hits it off with him. Well, at that point, it's not a temptation at all, because he has been so formed through the process of his decision-making. He has moved so far down the trajectory of virtue that now it's not even a problem, because he's better. Just like if you condition yourself as a runner, you might, throw up and pass out after you run a mile on the first day, but 6 months later, you can go out for an 18, 20-mile run and feel good when you finish. Right? It's not even that big of a deal because you're so conditioned. Yep.
How do you condition yourself to go the other way? Whether you started out unvirtuous and wanted to move toward virtue or virtue to unvirtuous?
Well, just like in the other scenario, I mean, I'm glad you said that. This is such a crucial point. To move on the trajectory of virtue takes effort. So the guy in the scenario who's so attracted to the other woman, it's not his wife, he has to fight that. He has to say, no, and tooth and nail, claw his way out of the temptation, says, whatever happens, I'm going to be faithful. And remember the statue of Plato's, aspects of the soul? The charioteer is yanking those reins back and all his muscles are taut and he's giving it all he's got. To move toward virtue takes effort and strength and struggle. To move toward vice takes nothing. To move toward, and this is controversial because it assumes that we have a corrupt nature. That it's easiest, it's most natural for us just to slide down into virtue or vice, right? Because the guy in the situation, all he has to do is say, okay. I mean, what's easier? What's easier in that situation? To fight and say, no, I'm going to be faithful, or say, sure, let's meet up after work. That's natural. That's easy, right? What's easier if you sign up for the marathon? Just to sit on your couch and watch YouTube videos about marathons and drink a milkshake? Or to actually get out and start grunting and sweating on the road and run, right? To develop, another way to say it is, one trajectory is that of development, building, establishing. The other trajectory is one of deterioration, decay, moving away, destruction, disorder, disintegration. And that's always, it takes effort to go build something. You don't have to do anything to let the building just collapse into decay, right? Just leave it alone. So that's the crucial point. And that's why, vice and don't get me wrong, that's a complex thing, but the, not divorce, but the divorce rate, okay? I mean, the number of divorces, okay? I mean, from things like adultery. That's why that's so common, because that's the easy way. I mean, that's the way that requires no resistance or effort or struggle. Yeah. And here's another way to the point about immunity, too. Okay, if I'm at a center point where I'm not really, I'm kind of like the person, Screwtape Proposes a Toast, talks about, where you have this person just in limbo. They're not really good or bad. If you ever read that, if you remember rather, but Screwtape Proposes a Toast, this guy who's just, he can't be condemned by the devil because he's never done anything wrong, but he can't really be commended by God because he never did anything right. He's just in the middle, right? So if you take this 0 point and you go to this direction, it's to slide into deterioration and destruction and vice. If you go in this direction, it's to move toward virtue and the perfect life. Well, okay, let's say, lying on your taxes is the first step here, right? And then the first step on this way is being honest on your taxes even though it costs you $1,000. All you had to do is check the other box and you would have saved $1,000, but that's a lie. And you don't want to lie because that's virtuous, right? Okay, well, from this point, can you see how or why somebody would cheat on their taxes? Well, sure, because it's not that far, right? You can understand that, right? But you go to the next point where you tell the truth when it costs you $50,000. Let's say you have a house you're trying to sell, and there's something wrong with the foundation, but nobody knows it but you. And if you admit it, if you make it known to the buyer, you're going to lose $50,000 on the sale price, right? That's a lot, right? Okay, well, this person, instead of just cheating on the taxes, let's say he actually goes and embezzles $50,000 from the IRS or whatever, because he's a computer hacker. Well, now, can this person understand why you would go and embezzle $50,000? No, there's a distance here. That's so far away, I can't even get my mind around, right? Well, you move on down the line. And then you come to a point where you have some person over here that hears of some heinous crime over here, and they say, I can't even conceive how a human being would do X. Well, the reason why is because this person is so far down this road, it's such a distance down that road, that they're in two different worlds, right? I heard a great analogy recently, and I've never heard this before, I thought it was great. He says, you have bees that go to flowers, right? Bees pollinate flowers, so if you want to find bees, look for the flowers. If you want to find flowers, look for bees. And flies, in contrast, congregate around something else, right? That's opposite of flowers. And this is a great analogy. This is the point of it. The person said, if you ask the fly where the flowers are, they won't know. They'll never be able to tell you. In fact, they may not even know what flowers are, because that's not the kind of creature a fly is. And then, in contrast, if you were asked the bees, where is the dung pile, they wouldn't be able to tell you, because all they know is flowers. And that's a good picture of that trajectory. You know, when you get at a certain point down either way, you'll lose sense of the other side. You know, I mean, it's a great line from C.S. Lewis that says, kind of put it in a little bit different angle, but it's a similar principle. He says, good people know good people know right and wrong. Right? Good people know right and wrong. We understand clearly this is right, this is wrong on fundamental things. Bad people know neither. Right? I mean, I use the example of adultery. You know, one of the most common responses when someone commits adultery is, well, it's what? One word. You understand, it's complicated. It's complicated.
So bad people what?
When is the response if someone commits adultery?
No, say before that.
I said, good people know right and wrong.
Bad people?
Bad people know neither. They don't know right or wrong. They have no clear sense. You talked about epistemology. So the adjective form of epistemology is epistemic, right? So when you move down the trajectory of vice, it brings you into an epistemic fog, where who can know these kind of things, right? I don't know. Adultery? Well, I mean, some people call it adultery, but it's complicated. Is it? You had sex with a woman when you're married to another woman. Is that complicated? Well, who can say? It's all gray. It's all a fog. You can't quite see. Where the person who stays faithful says, no, it's adultery. It's pretty cut and clear. Yeah? It's not. That's not to undermine the difficulty of certain emotions and relational situations, but that's part of that trajectory. Not only do you become, or let's say in process of becoming an invirtuous person, what goes along with that is you lose your capacity to even recognize virtue, to even know it for what it is, because the flies don't know where the flowers are, right? And by the same token, the further you go toward the flowers, you don't really have any sense of what the dung pile is, because that's just so foreign to what you're all about, right? That's the path of virtue or not. And when Aristotle says, hey, here's the question, is there a purpose for a human being? Is there really an ethos? When we talk about ethics, are we talking about something that matters, something that's real, that is there a real purpose or essence of a human being? He says, yes, it's to go down that path of struggle toward virtue. That's what we exist for. That's how you play the human instrument well. Right? That's the answer to the purpose question. Yeah.
Is the formation thing a lot about give your brain light or allowing darkness? Right? Like.
Yeah, I think, like you said, the word allow. Is it like pursuing light?
Yeah, because you are giving light.
Right.
You are going the right direction, or you allow darkness and you go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think that word allow is really key to what I was saying, because I don't remember who said this, but there's a famous quote, you've probably all heard it before, that all it takes, I'm paraphrasing, but all it takes for Evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing,
Yeah.
right? Anybody know where it comes from? I can't remember who said that. But similar principle. It's that word allow. That it's not that maybe you didn't do anything, you didn't actively go, embezzle the money or burn down the building, but you sat back and allowed. You just let things slip in, go their natural course, Like I said, the construction analogy, or say a garden is another one. Well, if you don't do anything to a garden, it's going to be ugly and barren and full of weeds, and it takes no effort to get an ugly, unfruitful garden. If you want it to be lush and verdant and fruitful, you have to get out every day and weed it and water it and tend to it, right? It takes that effort. So hopefully that makes clear why I say that this is so crucially important and so relevant to everyday life, because every one of those, even seemingly inconsequential decisions, have that power of character formation, and it's a subtle process that takes place over a long period of time, but we're all becoming, we're all being formed, and it's the way that we choose to behave and to respond to scenarios and to interact with other people, and it's whether or not we choose to pursue the virtuous path. That's the thing that turns us into whatever it is we're going to be. And like I said, I think all of us can, it's not hard to see how that would apply to a lot of things in our immediate circumstances in life. All right, one more quote here, and this is great because it leads us right into our discussion of Ivan Ilyich. Look at this paragraph here above the blue star. Aristotle says, "Since all knowledge and every pursuit aim at some good, what do we take to be the end of political science?" Or let's say the science of how to create a society in which people can flourish. What is the highest of all practical goods? Well, so far as the name goes, there is pretty general agreement. It is happiness, say both ordinary and cultured people. And they identify happiness with living well or doing well. But when it comes to saying in what happiness consists, opinions differ. And here's the key line. And the account given by the generality of mankind is not at all like that of the wise. Now, that sounds maybe a little arrogant, but I think it's absolutely true. And apparently it was just as true 2,400 years ago with Aristotle in ancient Greece as it is for us today. The account given, that is, of what consists of happiness, what makes people truly happy, the account given by the generality of mankind or the general population is quite different from that of those who are wise. Here's a really quick illustration of what I mean. It is clearly and consistently conveyed to all of us if we pay attention to advertising, to social media, to popular sentiments conveyed in movies and TV and pop culture throughout, that three things that always will make you happy, and in fact, three necessary ingredients for true happiness and fulfillment are money, fame, status of some kind. You have to have a title of importance, you have to be able to impress people, you have to have a lot of money, and you need to be attractive and have a lot of sex appeal. If you don't have those things, you can't really flourish as a human being, you can't ultimately be happy, and if you do have those things, then you necessarily will flourish and be happy. And that is fundamentally false. All right? And yet, that arguably is the majority view. All right? If we judge by what we see in pop culture, that's supposed that we're told in no uncertain terms in myriad ways that that's how you live the good life. And it's just not true. And wise people know that it's not true. And like I said, apparently the same contrast was in play in Aristotle's time. And if that sounds controversial, how long do you think it would take if I closed this and opened up Google to look for some millionaire celebrity that's utterly miserable because they're in rehab or bankruptcy or divorce court for the 7th time or something like that? That would take about 60 seconds, right, to find somebody that fits that description of some sort. And we know that. And there's such a, and it doesn't mean that you can't be happy and have those things, but the idea that money, status, power, good looks and sex appeal and athleticism and so forth, that this is what it means to really live. That's just patently false. We see that all the time. People who have all those things and live miserable lives. And yet, it's the popular view. So, says Aristotle, it is a popular view, but not the view of the wise. All right. So that's all I'm going to say about Aristotle for now, about virtue ethics. But the gist of it is, again, the central purpose is the life of virtue, and the way you achieve that is through the development of habits. All right, with that being said, unless there's any other questions, I wanted to start at least, just make some preliminary comments on Ivan Ilyich before we close out for the day. I am very excited to be able to read and discuss this book with you because I read this many years ago for the first time, and it made a profound impression on me. It's one of the most significant books I've ever read. I reference it in conversation very frequently with a number of different people, and I hope that you find it as significant as I have. It's a very simple book. It's not complex. The story is not hard to grasp or follow. And to put it very bluntly, the bottom line lesson of the story is don't waste your life. Don't waste your life living for the wrong things, and specifically the wrong things that everybody tells you you're supposed to be living for. Because that's what Ivan does in the story. And he winds up in a state of bitter regret. Now, that's the bottom line, but of course the story is told so artfully and effectively that it's much to our benefit to take time to read through it. And by the way, I want to comment on something, just a side note here, that I commented on with the other class, so I wanted to say this to you too. Aristotle's emphasis on habits really brought this to mind. And also, Ivan's a good contrary example in that this is exactly the kind of thing you see completely absent in the character of Ivan. But when we talk about education and being an educated person, I think that should go along with being a virtuous person. And by that, I do not mean someone's intelligence or IQ or just their sheer intellectual abilities. That's not what being an educated person necessarily means. But just keeping in mind Aristotle's emphasis on habits building up over time. I hate to say this, but it's true. What's to be gained just from a class like this, or any class, on a university campus, is pretty limited. I mean, you could easily come in here, and many people do. You could easily come in here and focus in on all the demands on the syllabus, all the assignments you have to get turned in, and what the reading is, and come out with 100 average, do extremely well academically, and really get nothing out of the class in terms of any difference in your personal life and enriching you in such a way that you're better off because you took this class or you read this material. What real education is not just what we do twice a week in class like this, but like Aristotle says, it's a development of habits, a way of living life. And what that way, the way of the educated person, the life of the mind, you might say, what it means is things like, more than just this, but certainly entails this, engaging in conversations with people about things that really matter. And sometimes those people are hard to find. But finding people, and when you do find a person, you deliberately connect with that person, and you have extended conversations. Maybe you sit up late at night. Maybe you sit for 2 hours in the coffee shop or whatever. But you talk about politics and religion and all these things that people just don't want to get into. You find somebody that really sees the value in that, and as you talk to people and you engage in those kinds of conversations, you'll find that you begin to understand things, that things occur to you in the process of conversation that you would have never thought of on your own. You make a deliberate point, and like I said, it comes to be a lifestyle that you engage with people like that. And when you do, you begin to gravitate toward people like that, and they gravitate toward you. And both of you, or however many there are, you begin to develop a richer life that way. And you begin to develop more understanding about things that matter. Or another aspect of it is arranging your schedule in such a way that at least weekly, if not daily, you've got a time and a space where you can go and be free of distraction, where everything's turned off, and you can sit down with a book or an article or whatever, and you may only read 2 pages, but you read it slowly and methodically, and you stop and you think about what the person is saying, and you think, I'm not sure about that. Oh, that's really important. And you let it savor, and you savor it in your mind, and you really consider it, and you think of it, weeks later, what you were reading on the previous day, and you think, oh yeah, that's like this, and you make these connections, and it's a way of living. It's a way of again, a habit, a way of seeing the world and assessing your experiences, where you think and you slow down and you really try to see things. This is what Plato says is the definition of a true philosopher, that you see things for what they really are, that you want to know the true essence of the thing, not just what works, what gets you through, what gives you financial security, right? That's education. Right? Education is a virtue, and one of the virtues in Aristotle's understanding of the virtuous life is that the virtue of the intellectual life and living in such a way that you develop your mind. And then in the development of the mind, you develop your character virtues, and then you see all the more through reflection the significance of those virtues. And then you surround yourself with people who also see that. And it's this whole process of enrichment and development, and it turns you into a certain kind of person. Perfect person, necessarily, in a short time at least, but it's very important, and I emphasize that so much because that is so radically different than the way we're often conditioned to live, and all the more so in our, highly wired, connected, supercharged, entertainment-saturated world. It's so easy, to live and just stay at the superficial level, and never get, into the deep. So, keep that in mind when we're thinking about, when we read Aristotle and we talk about habits, and when you look at the contrary example of Ivan Ilyich, who lived his entire life until the end at the superficial level, and then regretted it very, very deeply. All right. So, tell you what, instead of us getting into the first page here, we'll save that for Tuesday. But let me ask you a question before we check out. We've got a few minutes. What do you think, in light of what I just said, what do you think? I know that there's some obvious answers like, well, social media and smartphones and that kind of thing. But being as specific as you can, what are some things that make it most difficult for us to develop the life of the mind, for us to really focus in on substantial things? Or let me say it another way, what is it that makes it most easy for us to stay on the surface of life? What are some particular things that make it so easy just never to get into the depths? Zach?
I think there's a lot of social stigma about being vulnerable.
Yeah?
And I mean, especially among men as well, just the pressure to maintain a certain image that doesn't have emotions or whatever. But in reality, everyone is a lot deeper than that. And,
Right.
And like being able to get past that stigma or like the expectations of society on us, we can live a more fulfilling life, being more open with people.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Social stigma is a huge factor, and because usually we just think about distractions of the internet or whatever. But yeah, that's a big one. And you're going to say?
Yeah. I don't know. I just think that there's a big thing with like the comfort zone as well, where like we'll fall into a comfort zone or like the same routine, and that'll just like prevent us from progressing. And then once we're outside that comfort zone, obviously we don't feel comfortable. That's when we can make that zone even bigger, and that's when we actually start progressing. We're not like plateauing.
That's a great way to say it. I love that. When you get outside of your comfort zone, in time you actually expand your comfort zone, because the things that used to be difficult to talk about and that made you uncomfortable, when you really engaged in, that becomes something you're comfortable talking about, and it's all the better. Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. Yes.
I think it's a sense of protection. If we are here, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm protected.
Safety.
Yeah, safety.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's why we stay in the comfort zone, because we feel sheltered, right? We feel protected. Yeah, it's Jack, right?
Yeah, Jack. Kind of going off the laws of inertia, we don't want to move. Like we're in the comfort zone. We kind of want to stay where we are, and the outside force is uncomfortable. It's a lot of effort. It's difficult to get to kind of the epistemology too, to look inward and question why you're doing things the way you're doing or where you want to be. And
Right.
I think a lot of that is being uncomfortable and just not really being willing to put in the effort to get where you want to go.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's in play a lot too, a lot of emphasis in our lives on this, identity. We talk about identity politics, right? So one of the things that makes it so hard to get out of the comfort zone is that it's not just comfortable, but it's how we define ourselves, right? So let's say if you're adamant, just rabid Republican, and you identify, that's part of who you are, and you got a Trump flag, on your car or whatever, and that's your team, that's your place, that's your identity. Well, what if you engage with conversation with somebody who you know is a pretty reasonable person, and you know is pretty trustworthy, and yet they question it and say, you know what, maybe some of the Democratic policies are good. Can you handle that? You know, is that, or vice versa? If it's a Democrat, you know, same thing. And we could choose any other field too than politics, but when we stake our identity in certain things, to have those questioned or criticized or undermined, that's what keeps us locked in, because that's hard to withstand. Colton?
I think as well within social media and within, I guess, the fact that we're all kind of being watched by technology itself, it's all also, because of that, catered to us to make us feel comfortable in the way that we are right now.
Right.
And therefore, it doesn't challenge us on anything.
That's the Google algorithms,
We
right?
interact with other people who have opposing views on our own.
And you know, the Google algorithms, right? That you search one thing and then it gives you all the other things related. So YouTube, same way. So you get this. They want you to. You know, they make it so that you, like you said, you stay in it. And you have to be all the more deliberate. So yeah, good point. Yeah, Ryan.
I was going to take a twist on Uncle Ben's famous quote that great power comes great responsibility. I personally believe that knowledge is power. And so when you take time to look inward and to gain true knowledge about yourself, about the way you think, we talk about epistemology, you gain that knowledge about yourself, but you become much more responsible for your actions, the way you think, and that's not as attractive to many people. It's a lot easier to just coast and to avoid that responsibility for their own lives.
Ignorance is bliss, right?
Exactly.
The less I know, the less I'm responsible for, and the less I have to do, and the less changes I have to make, right?
The less trouble you can get in, right? The less
Yeah.
responsible you are for those actions.
Right. Absolutely right. I mean, yeah, if there's some horrible evil rampant in the world, wouldn't you rather just not know about it? Now, of course, it's going to destroy everything in a little while, but still, it didn't, you know. All right. Hey, good discussion, guys. I appreciate that, and I hope you have a good weekend. And like I said, let me know if you have any questions.
I do stand there. Yeah. I just wish I had more money. So I could do more out there. Yeah.
It's like a lot cooler hobbies in fact, right?
Right.